It is the middle of September 1777. You look out your window and you see General Washington and his Continental Army moving throughout the fields, farmlands, and countryside of your home. Join us today as we look to uncover the relatively unknown history of Camp Pottsgrove. September of 1777 saw Washington and his army on the move once again. Throughout present-day Montgomery County and Chester County, the Continental and British armies played a game of cat and mouse, which eventually led Washington to establish an encampment known today as Camp Pottsgrove. The monument for this encampment can be found today at the corner of Swamp Pike and Foss Road. We welcome author and historian Michael C. Harris as he explains the importance of this encampment.
We're standing here in front of the Frederick Annie's house, which George Washington will use the yard of this house as his headquarters during an encampment known as Camp Pottsgrove. But before we get into Camp Pottsgrove, we need to understand how Washington and the Continental Army got here. What were the events that led to them getting here? So in 1777, we have something called the Philadelphia Campaign, where the British Army takes a massive army out of New York City, by ship. They come up the Chesapeake Bay, they land in northeastern Maryland, and they start to maneuver in an attempt to capture Philadelphia. Washington and his army has to move from northern New Jersey, cross the Delaware River to confront that British army. And one major battle and a minor engagement are going to set up the process for them to get to this point. One is the Battle of Brandywine on September 11th, 1777, down in southeastern Pennsylvania, basically southern Chester County. And then 5 days later on September 16th, something called the Battle of the Clouds. And the Battle of the Clouds is a relatively minor engagement down in Chester County. But the important thing is a massive rainstorm breaks out as that battle is developing. And it causes two problems for Washington and the British Army. It's going to flood all the creeks and the rivers in the area, specifically the Schuylkill River, which is the last natural barrier between the British Army and Philadelphia. Because of the massive flooding of the river, after the Battle of the Clouds, Washington can't cross that river. The other thing that happens is the driving rainstorm got into all the Army's ammunition. Ammunition in the 1700s was wrapped in paper. So if the paper got wet, the gunpowder got wet, and the ammunition is useless, and they have to resupply. So for those two reasons, Washington, the night of September 16th and into the 17th, has to retreat into northwestern Chester County to Warwick Furnace, an iron furnace in the area. That puts him closer to a resupply coming out of Reading, and it will also allow some time for the flooded conditions of the creeks and the Schuylkill River to sort of subside, because not only can Washington not cross the Schuylkill River at this point, neither can the British Army. So while Washington is out at Warwick Furnace, the British Army moves into northern Chester County and camps between Tredyffrin Township and where Valley Forge is today. And Valley Forge at the time was just a crossroads that had a mill complex. There was a sawmill and an iron forge, hence Valley Forge. And they will occupy that area on September 18th. That's 2 days after the Battle of the Clouds. Fast forward to September 19th, Washington and the Continental Army are on the move again. They are going to move from Warwick Furnace. They are going to cross the Schuylkill River at Parker's Ford. This is modern Linfield, Pennsylvania. And there's a modern bridge not far from the Ford site. And they move east. They start to move east to be able to block the Schuylkill River fords. The fords being places people could walk across the river in the 18th century. So he wants to block those fords, because if he keeps the British Army south of the river, they can't get to Philadelphia. Because keep in mind, in the 1700s, Philadelphia was not on both sides of the river like it is today. So Washington on the 19th moves up through Trap, and they camp along the Perkiomen Creek. And Washington himself establishes his headquarters at a house near the Episcopal Church in modern-day Evansburg, on Germantown Pike today is where that's located. The next day, the 20th, they move even farther east, and they are going to deploy the army between Gordon's Ford, which is modern-day Phoenixville, and Swedes Ford, which is modern-day Norristown. And Washington establishes headquarters at a tavern called Thompson's Tavern, which was at the intersection of Ridge Pike and Egypt Road in West Norton Township. It's the site of a gas station today. All right, while they are in that position, on the night of September 21st, you have the Battle of Paoli behind the British Army down in Chester County. And that kind of messes up all of Washington's plans, because the idea was, while he was blocking the fords north of the river, one of his divisions under Anthony Wayne was supposed to attack the rear of the British Army while they were trying to cross the river. It was supposed to be like a pincher movement. Well, with the British found out that Wayne was back there, and they launched an attack in the middle of the night, and they basically take out his division. Well, that messes up all of Washington's strategic plans. So he now no longer has that force in the rear of the British Army. So that also allows the British Army to move closer to the fords. They move up the entire army to the Valley Forge area, and they extend west towards modern-day Phoenixville. And when they start to extend west, Washington starts to think that the British are going to head towards Reading, which is their supply depot, and that freaks him out. So on the night of the 21st, Washington shifts away from the Norristown area and away from the Phoenixville area into Limerick Township. And he will camp at the intersection of Ridge Pike and Lawyers Ford Road, which again, that's in Limerick Township today. Actually, it might have been Limerick Township at the time too. The British on the 21st, they send a detachment across the river to try to convince Washington that they are heading west. But it's really just a ploy. They don't really want to go west. They want Philadelphia. And so Washington again is afraid of protecting his supplies in the Pennsylvania backcountry, and he shifts. He pulls out of Limerick Township, marches west on Ridge Pike, makes the right on the Swamp Pike, and moves up into the area where we're standing now, into an area that was known as Pottsgrove in the 18th century. And I'll come back to that in a second. Because Washington shifts away, it opens up all the lower river fords for the British Army, and they cross the Schuylkill River on September 22nd and camp in modern Norristown, actually on the grounds of where the high school is today in Norristown. So Washington ends up here, and this becomes known as Camp Pottsgrove. Now, do not confuse that with Pottsgrove Manor, which is the home of John Potts in the 18th century, which is in Pottstown today. This whole region, this whole area of northwestern Montgomery County, modern Montgomery County, was known as Pottsgrove in the 18th century. The whole region was. There was also a swamp near here called Faulkner Swamp, which is just southeast of where we're standing now. So the idea is, if Washington got behind the swamp creates a barrier in case the British wanted to attack him here. And so it was a safe place to regroup, receive reinforcements, resupply the army, rest the army, and they arrived here on the 22nd of September. And he makes his headquarters again in the yard of this house, the Frederick Annie's house. Now, what happens while the army is camped here? What major events in terms of the campaign? Because the army will be camped here for 4 days, or parts of 4 days. He will hold a council of war here, because Washington wants to attack the British Army. He wants to strike a blow, so to speak. And so he holds a council of war with his senior commanders, and they debate whether or not to launch an attack. And there was two issues at hand. There was reinforcements en route from the Hudson River Valley, reinforcements from the Northern Army. Anthony Wayne, who had been defeated at Paoli, had yet to rejoin the army. And so that was one of the debates. Do we wait for reinforcements? The other issue is they're not real close to the British Army at this point. The British Army at this point is all the way down in central Montgomery County, in the Norristown area, and they're all the way up here in the northwestern part of the county here at Camp Pottsgrove. So the council decides not to attack. They want to wait for two things. They want to wait for reinforcements, and they want to wait till they can move closer to the army to make a surprise attack a little easier. And that will eventually come at the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, but not till the army moves out of here. Another major occurrence, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Smith of the Maryland Line is dispatched from here. He's given a new assignment. He's sent to Fort Mifflin. Now, Fort Mifflin still stands. It's on, historically it would have been south of Philadelphia, just below or just south of the mouth of the Schuylkill River, where it empties into the Delaware. And it was a barrier to prevent the British Army from coming up the Delaware River, or not the British Army, the British Navy. And so there was a fort there that was meant to protect the river access to Philadelphia. And Washington wants to hold that fort. It'll play a major role moving forward in the campaign. So from here, Smith is dispatched to take that command. Also, while they are here, the British will move from Norristown, or what's Norristown today, and set up a camp in Germantown, which is where they will be camped for the Battle of Germantown. That happens while they are camped here. And the last major thing that happens while they are camped here is the occupation of Philadelphia. The British will march a detachment from their camp at Germantown down into Philadelphia along what's now Germantown Avenue to begin the 9-month occupation of the colonial capital of Philadelphia. The same day the British move into Philadelphia is the day that the Continental Army and George Washington leave Camp Pottsgrove. They will march east down modern Route 73, which is known as Skippack Pike at the time, and camp at Pennypacker Mills, which is another Montgomery County historic site. And that's where the campaign will continue from there, eventually including the assault on Germantown in October.
Once Washington decided to establish his camp at Pottsgrove, his soldiers would have gone out and begun to build their camp. One of the first things needed was fire. As you can tell, this soldier is busily preparing his fire and is showing off his fire starting kit. This kit would have contained flint, steel, char cloth, and towel. In order to start the fire, the soldier will take his towel and form it into a bird's nest. From there, he will place the char cloth into the middle of that towel. He will then take the flint and strike it against the steel in order to cause a spark that will light the char cloth and eventually the towel. With the fire now lit, this provided a much-needed comfort while in camp. Soldiers would use this fire to help dry out clothing, keep them warm on cooler fall evenings, as well as prepare the rations that they would be provided. The next step in establishing a camp was to provide shelter. Shelter was important because it kept the elements off of you while you were in camp. Camp Pottsgrove was an encampment in which the Army's main focus was to rest and recuperate. A proper shelter allowed the soldiers the ability to mend clothing, keep ammunition dry, and prepare the necessary tools for the upcoming march. Even though soldiers were allotted tents in the 18th century, utilized makeshift shelters in their encampments. Booths were most common, being constructed with brush and trees from the surrounding countryside. In this case, these soldiers are using a split rail fence to construct a covering for their camp. The time spent at Camp Pottsgrove was important for the common soldier. On September 23, 1777, General Washington wrote a letter to John Hancock requesting much-needed supplies for his army. Many of his men were without shoes and blankets, and these vital supplies were requested to be provided to the army from the county of Lancaster. With their camp now set up, let's explore the rations that a typical soldier would receive while at Camp Pottsgrove. A typical soldier's ration during the American Revolution changed multiple times throughout the entire war. In 1775, it was laid out that a soldier should receive 1 pound of bread, a half a pound of beef and a half a pound of pork, 1 pint of milk, 1 quart of good spruce or malt beer, 1 gill of peas or beans, 6 ounces of good butter per week, 1 pound of good common soap for 6 men per week, or a half a pint of vinegar per man per week. Little is known of what the actual soldiers received at Camp Pottsgrove. What is known is that ovens were established in order to bake fresh bread for the soldiers each day.
It must have been quite a sight for those living in the Pennsylvania countryside in the fall of 1777. For if they looked outdoors, they might have a glimpse of the Continental Army as it marched through. Now, if they waited long enough though, they might have seen at the end of the army train people who were burdened down with wash tubs, cooking instruments, and children. It was the camp followers, those who followed and worked with the army, although they were not technically in the army. Camp followers were mostly women who had personal instead of professional goals with the army. They were attached somehow, working with a husband, brother, father, and serving in the army by doing what most women would do normally. Lots of washing, some cooking, sometimes nursing. Camp followers are those who were the support system of the army. If the army did not survive, if it did not succeed, then neither would the revolution. To understand camp followers, you have to understand that they were a community. Article 23 and Section 13 of the 1776 American Articles of War defined a camp follower as all settlers and retainers to a camp, all persons whatsoever serving with the armies of the United States. Camp followers were women, children, and men who worked alongside the army to do the support that the soldiers desperately needed. Soldiers alone do not make an army. Women who were formally attached likely got rations and maybe paid for the army. Otherwise, it was up to her to dictate her own wages. Women could face discrimination based on their gender, but their work mirrored the domestic labor of women back home. Washing and mending clothing, some cooking and caring of the sick, but there were also female settlers. Laundry was one of the most common tasks done by female camp followers. It justified their ration and it was a source of income for family, depending on their unit. An observer of the American Army said the soldiers looked so ragged due to the lack of women to mend their clothing. In 1780, laundry prices were set by company commanders at West Point, saying for a shirt, 2 shillings, woolen breeches, vest, and overalls, 2 shillings each. A linen vest and breeches, 1 shilling each. Linen overalls, 1 shilling and 6 pence each. Stockings, and handkerchief, 6 pence each. The American Army was not the only army to have camp followers. Almost every army in history has them, doing the same labor and work to support their friends and family as the American women were doing as well.
So everything you see before you is what a standard soldier during the American Revolution would have carried. I'm going to go through each part of it piece by piece and start donning all the equipment as a soldier would have done back during the Philadelphia campaign. And then you'll see how all the pieces come together and how a soldier would be fully kitted out as he marched off and would have fought in subsequent battles such as Germantown. So the first piece of equipment that a soldier would don would be his bayonet. This was considered one of the most important parts of a soldier's equipment, that it was the first thing that he would put on and it was the last thing that he would take off at the end of the day. After the bayonet, the next piece of equipment that would be put on was the cartridge box. The cartridge box consisted of a leather pouch and a wooden block with holes drilled out it to contain the cartridges.
Next piece of equipment is the haversack. If a soldier was lucky enough to be issued one, it would contain a wooden bowl, tin cup, and the basic utensils: a fork, a spoon, a pocket knife.
So everything you see here is what's remaining of a soldier's kit. All these items would be packed inside the knapsack and carried with the soldier wherever he went. Here you see a housewife. The housewife or sewing kit would contain all the soldiers' effects for mending his uniform, his clothing. The sewing kit consisted of scissors, thread, beeswax for coating the thread, spare buttons, and needles. You may also have linen tape, which was used to thread behind the buttons and go through the shank and hold them in place. Another piece of equipment that a soldier may have is what we call a market wallet. It's just a rectangular pouch with a center slit opening. He would take his personal effects, throw them into opposite ends of the pouch, and then it would be twisted in the center, thrown over his shoulder or into a knapsack. Soldiers would also carry an additional set of clothing with them if they were fortunate enough to have them. What you see before you is pretty standard. You would have a second set of stockings and a shirt, and we also have what is called a mammoth cap. Mammoth cap could be donned late at night for sleeping or while working around in camp. The last piece of equipment you see is a wool blanket. Not all soldiers were fortunate enough to have one, but if they were issued one or if they were able to procure one, that was the last piece of equipment that they would pack into their knapsack.
From September 22nd through the 26th of 1777, General Washington and his Continental Army called the countryside surrounding Pottsgrove home. This encampment was extremely important for his army to rest and recuperate for the rest of the Philadelphia campaign. We thank you so much for joining us today.